Hello, everybody, and welcome back to AACRAO's Credential Chats. We are joined this week by the Director of Learning Technologies from Georgia Institute of Technology, which I just learned is the same thing as Georgia Tech. I was confused for a minute there, whole life. I thought Georgia Tech was simply Georgia Tech. So, Eric Sembrat, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, glad to be here.
Eric, I'm really stoked to share just the research that you've been kicking off because you've been talking about this stuff for longer than most people, which means you've been thinking about it probably about as long as anybody. And it's really along, when we think about design, that what goes into badge design and the visuals, kind of style guides, and so maybe just kind of kick us off by sharing, what is this research you're doing, and what do people need to know about it?
Yeah, so I'll kick it off based on where I came from. So before I started as a faculty member, I was a staff member working in web development, so working in digital communications and marketing. And as you might expect, how things look and how they operate is super important, whether it's the website, whether it's your digital signage, whether it's the social media outlet you have. And so over the years, I've collected an absurd amount of knowledge in my head based on that area, thinking about the way that our internal end users, faculty, staff, students interact with our websites or web applications, how external entities like prospective students, parents of prospective students, prospective graduates or researchers interact with our digital presence. And so when I came on board in a faculty role for the Center for 21st Century Universities in our newly founded College of Lifetime Learning at Georgia Tech, one of the places that I naturally went to is as I learned more about digital credentials and the idea of verifiable academic records that I can own is there's a badge or a specific graphic associated with it. And so the question that I sort of popped up is where do we build out that standard or the visual design schema that exists there? And as I looked through research, talked to experts in the field and peers about different institutions, what I found is that there's kind of an implicit setup there, but in large part, it's, based on a number of different criteria, based on whatever the institution's focus is for their visual design of their micro credentials, digital credentials. And so as part of that, I've been conducting research with colleagues at Arizona State University and Purdue University's global campus to basically take a look and see what's out there in the ecosystem to understand what does the digital credential and micro credential suite for an institution look like, and then based on that little bucket of that single institution, what does it look like when we look at a larger picture? So our data set's looking at universities that have opted in to provide us their suite of micro credentials or digital credentials design for us to understand what are the visual components that are there that make up a visual design of a particular digital credential based on its, for example, rigor, quality, level of expertise to better understand what that looks like, both internally for the institution as well as what it looks like for the end user. What I'm concerned about is not so much what it looks like in an individual university. We're sort of overwhelmed with internal taxonomy. We love our acronyms and we use them across the ecosystem within our organization. But if I were to use that same acronym when applying for a job as a graduate of that university, they're probably not going to understand what I'm talking about. The same thing would be for some of the visual design. And so what I'm hoping to do is identify that standard that may be implicit or explicitly there to build out some quality of life improvements or recommendations that we can build on top of in the research space to guide what a good visual design of a micro credential or a digital credential would look like, not only for universities, but for so that employers can understand what a first look of a digital credential is without having to go through the metadata that exists there.
Mm. And as somebody who does not come from a comms background, or a design background, when you talk about this style guide and kind of standardize things, am I way off to picture, something like just a stoplight, and that, I can go around to different cities in, North America, and I can, see stoplights that are vertical, horizontal, some that have shade structures that make them easier to see when there's sun glare, but that generally speaking, there's this kind of standardized aesthetic that lets me know when to stop, when to, slow down because I'm not going to make it, and when to go.
Yeah, that's a good analog for it. You have an existing design language where there are different permutations or variants that exist there. And based on that knowledge that you know, sort of allows you to make that just-in-time knowledge when you see a stoplight that's, for example, upside down. Throws your brain for a loop for a second when you're like, something seems off there. And then you make that connection there. And from a sociocultural standpoint, we do that throughout our day when we encounter something new. For example, if you're on your institution websites, likely you have a sort of default visual design of your websites. And when you navigate something that's perhaps older, a little different, a little customized, it'll throw you off to where's the menu? What does the menu look like? How do I get to the sub menu pages? What does this heading mean? You see this with your cell phone and new apps that exist. If there's an app that has a unique visual design, sometimes going through it and figuring out what the icons mean or what the terminology means can be a bit of a game changer if you're unfamiliar in the space. And so with digital credentials and micro credentials, it's largely the same thing. One analog that I make is when we look at degrees. So I've got, of course, my degrees on my wall, because what else am I going to do with them? I got one over there, just off screen, another one there. I don't know where the third one is. I think it's hiding somewhere else. But they all basically look the same. If it had, Georgia Tech's Buzz logo somewhere, it wouldn't have that regality there. But your formal degrees likely have a pretty straightforward visual style guide, no matter what your institution is for what you finish when you finish a degree program. Digital credentials really don't have that historical precedence there. We have that from the earlier version of open badges, and I would suspect with enough historical research, we would find that those early adventures in open badges version 1 and 2, the sort of specification that sort of brought along digital credentials and micro credentials, we'll find that a lot of the building blocks that are there ended up resulting what we see from a university style guide for micro credentials today. But having that knowledge codified in a study looking outside of the scope of an institution across institutions, the United States, is helpful, for example, for us to move forward and identify what we're implicitly or explicitly looking at. One of the things that came up when we were doing a sort of group think analysis on some of our research is when we had when we looked at the digital credentials as a whole for a university, and for example, maybe one of the researchers presented their own digital credentials as a sample, looking at it, they discovered, hey, there's a permutation or a specific category or a taxonomy of a digital credential where we didn't intend it to have this look or feel, but it did. And they couldn't really answer why, but specifically for that level of rigor or quality, it looks slightly different. And we're able to basically build out some consensus or derived reason why that might be implicitly done. And so as we go through and conduct this research, what we're expecting is that those things are going to pop up. But when we look at the samples that we have as a whole, I think we're going to find some commonalities there that we can begin to address when thinking about what it looks like when you present a micro credential or digital credential to an employer and how they're able to take that first look when they receive it and get the image or see it within a platform to be able to assess it at a very, very high level before they dive into the metadata and the associated code that's sitting in there that describes the accomplishment or achievement there.
Yeah, and just for anybody who's watching who heard Eric talking about open badges, similar if you've watched our episodes about CLR, Comprehensive Learner Record, open badge is a technical standard. So not all badges are created equal. Some are done on to a technical standard called the Open Badges Standard 1.0, 2.0, or now the newly released 3.0 standard. So just a little bit of badge explaining there for anybody who might not have been following that part, Eric. And I think that one of the themes we've been noticing over the last several months is this notion of what next. That these, things are not just things that we create, issue, and then that's it, but that actually thinking about how they get operationalized. And I hear you talking about the style guide, that these visual aesthetic elements are actually really important when we think about once it's been issued, that there's actually use happening here in the current or distant, not too distant future, that they're being operationalized and used, and that visual aesthetic is something that actually helps communicate to the audiences in meaningful ways beyond just, somebody seeing my Zoom background.
Right. And there's a lot to consider there. Not only sort of how your brand matures and how your institution brand changes over time, colors, shapes, iconography, the icons that you use, the standards that you have there change over time. If you were to look at my computer like when I was a teenager and the icons that represented all the email apps, for example, that I used 15 years ago, it's going to look slightly different than the mail app I use today on my desktop and on my phone. Those things are kind of part of life. Our sociocultural creations of what we interpret are drastically different. How we represent a menu as a hamburger or three horizontal lines is kind of an emergent moment of time. Will a menu look like that 15, 20 years or not from now? I hope not, but we'll see. I'm not really in charge of that, but we should see those things evolve over time. Part of me says that, universities have always changed brands and sort of updated their branding. Georgia Tech has experimented with different shades of gold because getting a, sort of metallic gold right on a computer screen is I'm not a graphic designer, but I play one on TV. What I understand is it's easier said than done. So my impression is that there's always tinkering to be done to make that work, and you kind of expect that for your how you interpret your university brand. Georgia Tech just went through a entire rebrand on our institute logo. So the logo we use for Georgia Tech across all of our academic materials. And, that has an impact. If we were to issue digital credentials or micro credentials 10 years ago, our brand usage of our university name would look slightly different than it looks today.
Yeah, and speaking of 10 years ago, and you sort of gave a nod to the legacy history of the, open badges movement, and that, as you and your co-researchers are digging into this, that you might find some sort of intentionality behind the way things are done. I also am going to be really curious if, similar to your colleague who surfaced a sort of consistent thing that was not necessarily intentional, if you also find that certain things were done really just because that was what was good for a vendor or something. But as you think of those things, that um, it just also for me really kind of highlights that we all have our precious things that we look for and notice, and even or even on the menu to be aware of. And so, the Georgia Tech just lucked out that the person occupying your seat is also somebody who comes from a communications background, right? And that, yeah, which kind of leads me to wonder in our closing moments here for our audience, as if I'm an AACRAO member, if I'm in, registrar, enrollment management professional, I'm thinking about these really important design elements, you know, how do I make this a team sport out of our offices, right? Or who else do we want at the table? I'm hearing that communications or strategic relations is probably good. You mentioned colors, and that makes me think about accessibility to even OIT or something like that. What does a team sport like this look like, and who else should we be leading with on this?
I think bringing in your institution brand is super important because it's always changing. There's always elements being added in, different sort of design elements being tested out, especially on the digital presence of your institution across the different media that you have. You've got social media, you got your website, you got your digital signage, you got photography and videography. All those things have those digital elements set in there. But one thing that I like that you mentioned, Noah, was accessibility, and that's a super important thing. Accessibility standards are at a federal level, always changing to be stricter and more in compliance with the changing nature of our digital landscape. 10 years ago, the idea of students using their cellular device to interact with their learning experience was probably a far-fetched idea for a lot of students. When I was in grad school getting my master's, like I just used a laptop and that was it. But with the cell phone becoming such a ubiquitous piece of technology within our educational system, we have to think about what a micro-credential badge looks like, both on a big screen and also on a tiny screen, and maybe on a Apple Watch, and all these different devices where that piece of digital media can live. And so for me, accessibility and having that sort of second guess of a subject matter expert that can look at colors, shapes, gradients, iconography, and tell you whether it's presentable if someone's got color blindness or they're using a screen reader and need to describe the image to them. What's the important part of the image that you're bringing to the table? And that's something that really through this research I'm trying to understand is when you look at a digital credential badge, what is the perfect visual information that you're looking to get across? Take out all the branding elements and, sort of sanitize it down to its bare minimum. What are you trying to show? And that really can help bring your constituents down and make sure you're sort of prioritizing the right information there.
Well, I'm just loving all that you're sharing, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us on AACRAO's Credential Chats. He is the Director of Digital Learning Technologies at Georgia Tech. And Eric, I know that the date may have passed, but was that a soft date? If people still want to try and send you what they have going on at their institution for you and your co-researchers, is there still time to get you examples from our institutions?
The soft deadline may have passed. However, the way I see this research is a starting point. So if you are interested in contributing to it, this is a foundational point for additional research because I think there's a lot of questions that come out of this. And having different institutions and universities' perspectives on how they're building out their micro credentials and digital credentials visually is helpful so that one day we can get to this where someone looks at a digital credential or micro credential on the wall and knows exactly what we're talking about and maybe understands where it's coming from just from what's right there.
Knowing what to make of credentials on our digital walls. I love it. Eric Sembrat, thank you so much for joining us on AACRAO's Credential Chats.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a badge worthy week, everybody. Bye bye.